Catherine de Medici was born into privilege, yet cloaked in insecurity. As a child of the powerful Medici banking dynasty in Florence, she had been trained to navigate the labyrinth of wealth and politics. But when she married Henry, the future king of France, she entered a court that never quite embraced her. Her Italian origins, her accent, and her foreign entourage branded her an outsider in a land that demanded a French queen in both blood and spirit. Catherine never forgot this rejection. It burned into her heart like an ember that could never be extinguished. From that fire, she forged habits that would haunt not only her own reign, but the destiny of France itself. The French court in the mid-16th century was a dazzling yet treacherous stage. Silk gowns swept across marble floors, whispers echoed behind gilded doors, and plots hatched faster than roses bloomed in the royal gardens. Catherine, though outwardly composed, immersed herself in hidden arts to keep power within her grasp. Her fascination with astrology, potions, and omens became more than superstition, it was survival. To her, every star that moved across the sky carried a secret about her family's fate. Every vial of powder could alter the balance of life and death. She collected knowledge the way others collected jewels, and she wielded it with far more deadly precision. Her chambers within the Louvre Palace were both elegant and unsettling. Alongside ornate tapestries and carved furniture stood locked cabinets filled with glass phials, dried herbs, strange powders, and small daggers tipped with toxins. Rumors spread among courtiers that Catherine's cabinet of curiosities was in truth a vault of poisons. Servants whispered that a single drop from her vials could bring slow agony or swift, silent death. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, Catherine never discouraged them. Fear was a weapon she understood well, and she cultivated it carefully. Among her most trusted advisors was an astrologer, whose fame spread across Europe, Nostradamus. Where others dismissed him as a cryptic charlatan, Catherine saw in him both a prophet and a shield. His predictions fascinated her visions of her sons, her enemies, even her own mortality. She invited him to court, treating him with unusual respect for a man of such mysterious origins. On many nights when others slept, Catherine would sit beside him in candlelit chambers, the scent of burning wax mingling with the bitter fragrance of crushed herbs. She listened intently as he unfolded visions of plagues, wars, and betrayals yet to come. Whether truth or illusion, his words gave Catherine both solace and strategy. If the stars foretold danger, she prepared. If they whispered opportunity, she seized it. Catherine's habits soon became the stuff of legend. Courtiers swore she moved through the palace like a shadow, listening to conversations that should have been private. They claimed she could read a man's secrets in the way he lowered his eyes or hesitated in his speech. At banquets, while others laughed and drank, Catherine would sit in silence, studying the hall as if every gesture, every spill of wine, revealed another plot. She carried charms, small amulets tucked into her sleeves or sewn into her gowns, believing they could ward off misfortune. Sometimes she even distributed these charms to her children, instructing them never to remove them. Her sons, future kings of France, were fragile in both health and character, and Catherine's paranoia grew with each passing year. Yet her obsession with control brought both power and peril. France in her time was a kingdom torn by religious strife, Catholics and Protestants clashing in riots, massacres, and political assassinations. Catherine, caught between factions, used her arsenal of secrets to keep balance. She arranged marriages not only for love or alliance, but as chess moves in a dangerous game. She fed misinformation to her enemies while cultivating loyalty through fear and rumor. Those who opposed her whispered that she was a sorceress, that she consorted with demons, that she sacrificed her conscience for dominion. But to Catherine, the truth was simpler. She had been denied trust and affection, so she built an empire on fear instead. One of the most chilling habits she cultivated was rehearsing control over death. Servants once found her alone in her chamber, staring at an ornate skull carved of ivory. her fingers tracing the hollow sockets as if memorizing the shape of mortality itself. In her gardens, she cultivated rare plants not for their beauty, but for their venom. Hemlock, belladonna, foxglove flowers that could adorn a vase, yet also slip into a cup of wine unnoticed. No one ever caught her administering poison, but the sudden deaths of rivals kept the rumors alive. Perhaps she never used her arsenal, perhaps she did. But in politics, appearance often outweighed truth, and Catherine let the whispers work in her favor. Despite her power, Catherine's life was ruled by insecurity. She feared betrayal at every turn. She feared the fragility of her children's lives, the fickleness of her nobles, the chaos of war. Perhaps most of all, she feared irrelevance, the idea that her name might fade into dust once her body lay in the tomb. These fears drove her to habits that seemed to others insane. Endless nights consulting horoscopes, endless days mixing powders, endless schemes designed to keep her family on the throne. Her reign became a theater of shadows, her habits the stagecraft that made her both revered and reviled. By the time Catherine reached her later years, her reputation was sealed. To her supporters, she was the wise matriarch who had preserved France during one of its darkest periods. To her enemies, she was the Italian witch who drenched the kingdom in suspicion and fear. But Catherine herself knew the truth. Without her habits, without her secrets, without her poisons and her stars, she would have been powerless in a court that had rejected her from the very beginning. For Catherine de Medici, survival itself had been an art, and her habits the brushstrokes of a masterpiece painted in both light and shadow. Mary Tudor, remembered in whispers in history books as Bloody Mary, carried a childhood of sorrow into the throne room of England. Born the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, her early years were filled with affection and the promise of power. But when her father broke from Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary's world collapsed. She was stripped of her title as princess, declared illegitimate, and separated from her mother. For years she endured humiliation, forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, a bitter reminder of her father's rejection. These scars never left her. They grew into obsessions that later defined her reign. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, she carried not just a crown but a burden of vengeance and devotion. She was 37, a woman past the usual age of marriage, childless, and hardened by years of persecution. To her, the throne was both justice and redemption. Justice against those who had scorned her mother. Redemption through restoring Catholicism to a kingdom fractured by her father's Reformation. Mary's habits, forged in pain, became the fiery rituals of a queen determined to cleanse England with holy flames. The palace at Whitehall soon became a theater of both devotion and dread. Mary rose early for Mass, kneeling for hours with rosary beads slipping through her fingers. Her chamber walls were adorned with crucifixes and paintings of saints, their eyes seeming to watch her every prayer. Candles burned endlessly, a constant glow of penitence and supplication. But behind the devotion lay iron resolve. She believed her reign was a divine mission to return England to the Catholic Church. Even if that mission demanded blood, her counselors brought her lists of suspected heretics, Protestants who defied the old faith, who printed forbidden tracts, who dared to preach reform. Mary reviewed these lists herself, quill in hand, her eyes steady as she marked names for trial. To her, this was no cruelty. It was salvation. Better, she believed, for a soul to burn in earthly fire than to perish eternally in hell. Yet to those who watched her sign, it was a chilling habit. As if she took grim satisfaction in a ritual of judgment, the burnings began. Nearly 300 Protestants were condemned during Mary's short reign. The executions were public, staged in marketplaces and fields, so all could witness the punishment of heresy. Mary rarely attended, but she often demanded detailed reports, the crowd's reaction, the condemned's last words, whether the fire took swiftly or slowly. On nights after executions, courtiers whispered that she appeared strangely serene, as though the flames purified not only England, but her own wounded spirit. Yet her reign was not all iron. Beneath the layers of cruelty was a woman desperate for love and legitimacy. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was meant to secure both. She dreamed of uniting England and Spain under Catholic rule, of bearing a son who would continue the sacred mission. She wore Spanish gowns heavy with embroidery, clung to Philip's presence, and watched the stars for signs of her fertility. When she believed herself pregnant, she decorated chambers in anticipation of a child, prayed for hours, and spread joy among her ladies. But the pregnancy was false, a cruel phantom that ended in bitter disappointment. For Mary, it was another wound upon a lifetime of wounds. Her habits reflected the torment of her heart. She paced corridors late at night, whispering prayers like incantations. She clutched relics to her chest as if they might anchor her trembling faith. At times, she seemed almost haunted by her mother's suffering, by her father's betrayal, by the ghosts of those she condemned. Yet by daylight, she returned to her fiery purpose, signing more lists, demanding more trials, feeding the flames she believed would save her realm. By the end of her reign, Mary was both feared and pitied. The people whispered of the queen who lit England in fire, who turned marketplaces into pyres of judgment. To Protestants, she was a tyrant. To loyal Catholics, she was a martyr of faith. But to history, she became Bloody Mary, a name that carried both horror and fascination. In her habits, kneeling until her knees bruised, whispering prayers through tears, signing names with cold resolve, Mary revealed herself not as a monster, but as a woman whose faith and pain had fused into fire. Anne Boleyn's story is one of allure, ambition, and a fatal obsession that reshaped the destiny of England. She entered the court of Henry VIII, not as a queen but as a lady-in-waiting, her dark eyes and quick wit outshining the jeweled halls. Unlike others who bent easily before Henry's will, Anne resisted, teasing him with her clever words and refusing to surrender her virtue. This defiance was her greatest weapon, for it drove the king into a frenzy of desire. Henry had grown restless with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Years of marriage had yielded only one surviving daughter, Mary. He longed for a son, a male heir to secure the Tudor line. The moment Anne captured his heart, she became not merely a lover but a vision, the woman who might give him the son his queen had failed to bear. Yet Anne understood the stakes. She would not settle for mistress. She demanded the crown. This demand became the spark of a revolution. Henry, blinded by desire, sought to annul his marriage to Catherine. But the Pope refused, fearing the wrath of Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V. Frustration consumed Henry, but Anne fed the flames. In whispered conversations, she urged him to ward defiance of Rome, telling him that kings, not popes, should hold God's authority on earth. Her words became seeds of the English Reformation. By 1533, Henry broke from Rome, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and married Anne. She was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. Dressed in lavish gowns of cloth of gold, her black hair crowned with a glittering diadem. For a moment, she stood triumphant, the woman who had toppled a queen, defied a pope, and bent a king's will, yet triumph carried shadows. Anne's habits, whispered through the court, were strange, even unsettling. She was known to play with her jewelry as though they were talismans, twisting rings and stroking pearls when anxious. She carried books of forbidden reformist prayers, marking passages with her quill, reciting verses late into the night. Some claimed she dabbled in charms. Her family coat of arms was embroidered with a falcon. Yet courtiers whispered she kept a small witch's book hidden among her gowns. Anne's sharp tongue, once her greatest weapon, became her peril. She mocked Henry's aging body, sparred with his advisors, and even quarreled with the king himself. Still, Henry forgave so long as Anne might give him a son. But her first child was a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry masked his disappointment, but the silence between them grew heavier. Anne miscarried twice thereafter, and with each loss, Henry's passion cooled. The court that had once buzzed with her wit began to turn against her. Rivals whispered that she bewitched the king, that her beauty was a mask for darkness. When Henry's eye wandered toward Jane Seymour, Anne's enemies struck. In 1536, accusations swirled: adultery, incest, witchcraft. They claimed she ensnared men with her eyes, that she spoke incantations under her breath, that she carried a deformity hidden beneath her gowns. Truth or fabrication, the charges sealed her fate. Anne was arrested, stripped of her jewels, and taken to the Tower of London. There, she displayed a strange composure. She laughed at her jailers, prayed fervently, and confessed only to loving the king too much. On the morning of May 19, 1536, she dressed in a crimson gown trimmed with ermine, the color of martyrdom. Her dark hair was bound beneath a simple headdress. Before the gathered crowd, she knelt gracefully, her hands folded. She spoke softly of her loyalty to the king, of her prayers for his reign, and then, with a swift stroke of the French executioner's sword, her story ended. But Anne Boleyn did not vanish. Her habits, her defiance, and her downfall lived on in whispers. Some said her ghost walked the tower, clutching her head beneath her arm. Others claimed her daughter Elizabeth inherited her cunning fire, turning it into the brilliance of England's golden age. Anne's shadow lingered over the Tudors forever, an enchantress whose ambition both remade and destroyed her. Elizabeth Tudor's life began in uncertainty and danger. She was born in 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, but her mother's fall left her branded as illegitimate before she was even 3 years old. The shadow of the executioner's sword hung over her cradle, for Anne Boleyn's ghost lived in every whisper around the young princess. Yet even as a child, Elizabeth displayed a sharp wit and quiet strength that marked her as her mother's daughter, raised under the care of tutors and noble guardians. Elizabeth's world was books and languages rather than crowns and jewels. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian before most children could read their own tongue. She could recite scripture with eloquence and debate philosophy with learned men. Yet behind her studies was constant danger. Her half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, often regarded Elizabeth with suspicion, seeing her as a rival to the throne. When Mary became queen, Elizabeth's position grew perilous. Mary, a devout Catholic, restored England to Rome, while Elizabeth leaned quietly toward Protestantism. Rumors swirled that Elizabeth was plotting rebellion, and she was imprisoned in the Tower of London. For 2 months she lived under the shadow of death, walking the same stone floors where her mother had awaited execution. But Elizabeth endured with caution, professing loyalty to her sister, masking her true thoughts behind a calm face. Her greatest weapon was patience. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne. At 25 years old, she inherited a kingdom divided by religion, threatened by foreign powers, and crippled by uncertainty. But Elizabeth possessed not only intelligence, but an instinct for performance. She understood that a monarch must embody more than law, they must become a living symbol. Her habits became legendary. She surrounded herself with mirrors and portraits, carefully shaping her image as the Virgin Queen. She wore elaborate gowns embroidered with pearls, her fiery red hair styled in intricate patterns, her face powdered white as porcelain. Her wardrobe became her armor, a dazzling spectacle that projected authority and awe. Elizabeth never married, though she entertained suitors from across Europe. Kings, princes, and dukes sent gifts and promises, but she always kept them at arm's length. "I will have but one mistress here," she famously declared, "and no master." To her people, she became wedded to England itself, the embodiment of their nation. Her reign was not without danger. In 1586, Catholic conspirators plotted to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. Elizabeth signed her cousin's death warrant reluctantly, knowing that the execution of a fellow queen would stain her soul. When Mary was beheaded in 1587, Elizabeth locked herself away, weeping in private though she showed strength in public. It was one of her darkest habits, the ability to grieve alone, then step before her court as though untouchable. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed against England. Elizabeth, dressed in a breastplate of silver over a white gown, rode before her troops at Tilbury. Her speech, carried on the wind, declared that though she was but a weak woman's body, she had the heart and stomach of a king. The image of her, standing resolute as cannons roared and sails burned forever, defined her. Reign. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, guiding England into a golden age of culture, exploration, and power. Yet her habits grew stranger as she aged. She plucked her face bare of eyebrows and wore wigs heavy with jewels. She painted her teeth with red to hide decay and bathed only rarely, clinging to youth through rituals of appearance. Courtiers whispered that she grew furious if anyone mentioned her aging, banishing those who dared bring mirrors too close. She died in 1603 at Richmond Palace, silent and pale, her crown passing to James of Scotland. Yet Elizabeth's legend endured. She was the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the star of England's ascent. Her habits, both dazzling and bizarre, shaped her into more than a ruler. She became an icon larger than life, forever remembered as the monarch who turned survival into majesty. Mary Stuart's life was marked by beauty, ambition, and tragedy, woven together in a tale that spanned courts and kingdoms. Born in 1542, she was just 6 days old when her father, James V of Scotland, died, leaving her a queen in swaddling clothes. From the cradle, she was a pawn of power. While regents ruled in her name, her childhood was spent in exile at the French court, where elegance and intrigue shaped her into a monarch of allure. In France, Mary thrived. She was raised alongside the royal children, fluent in French, Latin, and Italian, and gifted in music and poetry. Her striking appearance, tall, with auburn hair and luminous skin, made her the jewel of the court. At 15, she wed Francis, the Dauphin of France, sealing a bond between Scotland and France. For a brief moment, she seemed destined to be queen of two kingdoms. But fate was cruel. Francis died young, and Mary, a widow at 18, returned to Scotland, leaving behind the glittering halls of Paris for the rough stone castles of her homeland. Scotland was no easy throne. Divided between Catholic and Protestant factions, the nobles eyed Mary with suspicion. Still, her charm won many hearts. She often dressed in rich silks, yet spoke with a warmth that disarmed courtiers. But her habits were peculiar. She loved to disguise herself, roaming the countryside in plain dress to mingle with her people. At night, she composed melancholy verses, reciting them softly by candlelight. Some whispered that she sought omens in the flight of birds and the phases of the moon, habits that cast her as both enchanting and strange. Her greatest misfortune came with marriage. Her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was handsome but vain, jealous, and reckless. Their union soon soured, marked by bitter quarrels and betrayal. In 1567, Darnley was murdered in a mysterious explosion at Kirkhope Field. The scandal shook the kingdom. Worse still, Mary quickly married James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's death. To many, it looked like love born of blood. Nobles rose in rebellion, branding Mary an adulteress and a murderess. Defeated, she was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, where she miscarried twins conceived with Bothwell. Yet Mary was resilient. She escaped in disguise, rallied supporters, and fought once more. But her forces faltered, and she fled south, seeking refuge with her cousin, Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth, wary of her rival's claim to the English throne, placed Mary under house arrest. For 19 years, Mary lived as a prisoner in gilded captivity, moving from castle to castle under watchful eyes. She embroidered tapestries, wrote letters in cipher, and dreamed of freedom. Her charisma never faded. Guards, nobles, even servants often fell under her spell. But behind the beauty lay despair. She prayed for deliverance, seeing herself as God's chosen queen, unjustly caged. Plots gathered around her name. Catholic conspirators sought to free her and place her on England's throne. Whether she truly conspired or merely became the banner of other schemes, Elizabeth could not ignore the danger. In 1586, letters were intercepted, letters that seemed to prove Mary's complicity in a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. In 1587, after long hesitation, Elizabeth signed the warrant. Mary was led to Fotheringay Castle's Great Hall for execution. Dressed in black with a crimson petticoat beneath, symbol of martyrdom, she walked with dignity. Before the axe, she spoke of her Catholic faith and her loyalty to Christ. With calm composure, she laid her head upon the block. One stroke, then another, ended her tragic reign. Yet Mary's story did not end in silence. To Catholics, she became a martyr, her crimson habit immortalized in legend. To Protestants, she was a dangerous schemer whose beauty concealed ambition. But all agreed, she was a queen whose life, marked by passion and peril, was a tragedy writ upon the stage of Europe. The Great Hall of Stockholm Palace was drenched in the pale winter light of the north, its long windows rattling with the breath of a January storm. Inside, the courtiers shifted uneasily on the marble floor, cloaks wrapped tightly, their eyes fixed upon the throne. Upon that throne sat a woman whose presence unsettled every tradition they held dear, Queen Christina of Sweden. She was 23 years old, sharp of gaze, restless of spirit, and already notorious for her refusal to act as any queen before her. Christina had been raised not as a daughter, but as the heir of a warrior king. Her father, Gustavus Adolphus, had fallen on the battlefield of Lutzen when she was but 6, leaving her the only legitimate heir. From that day forward, her tutors filled her chambers not with embroidery and piety, but with Aristotle, Cicero, and Descartes. She spoke Latin more fluently than most bishops, quoted Seneca at banquets, and debated philosophy until dawn with professors dragged from Uppsala. But it was not only her intellect that startled her courtiers. Christina dressed in doublets and boots like a man, rode bareback across the icy fields, and swore in soldier's fashion. She detested the careful curls and silks her ladies pressed upon her, and instead wore her hair unkempt, her clothes plain. Most scandalous of all, she refused to marry. When suitors from every court of Europe offered themselves, she mocked them. "Why should I trade my crown for chains?" she asked with a sly smile. The nobility whispered that their queen was unnatural. The clergy thundered that she was a danger to the order of God. Yet Christina seemed to revel in the disapproval. Her court became a place not of tournaments and feasts but of books and paintings. She summoned philosophers, mathematicians, and artists from across Europe. She brought René Descartes to Sweden in the bitter winter of 1649, insisting on morning discussions by candlelight, though the cold soon killed him. Some said she had lured him to his death. Others claimed she was simply insatiable in her hunger for knowledge. Despite her eccentricities, Christina ruled fiercely. She negotiated with foreign envoys, strengthened Sweden's place among European powers, and steered her counsel with a sharp tongue. Yet she grew increasingly restless. "I was born to be king, not queen," she declared more than once. Her courtiers shuddered at such words, for they revealed the truth. Christina despised the role expected of her sex. By the time she was 25, the question of succession weighed heavily on her. She refused marriage, refused to bear heirs, and instead spoke of abdicating. Her counselors pleaded, threatened, and cajoled, but Christina only laughed. "I will not be prisoner to your crown," she said. "I will live as I wish." The breaking point came in 1654. In the summer hall of Uppsala, with nobles, bishops, and soldiers gathered, Christina stood before her people. The air was heavy with incense and expectation. She wore a simple black gown, her head unadorned, her eyes glittering with both defiance and relief. In her hands she held the crown of Sweden, heavy with jewels and centuries of history. Slowly, deliberately, she placed it upon the altar and turned away. Gasps and cries rippled through the assembly. No monarch had ever abandoned their throne in such fashion. When asked why, she gave many answers. The burden was too heavy, her health too frail, her spirit too wild. But the truth, whispered later in her private chambers, was simpler. I was born for freedom, not for duty. Christina left Sweden soon after, dressed in the clothes of a man riding south into Europe. She scandalized Rome by converting to Catholicism, fascinated philosophers with her wit, and charmed kings and cardinals alike. She never married, never bore children, and never ceased to provoke. To some, she was a madwoman. To others, a genius. To all, she was unforgettable. Thus ended the reign of Queen Christina of Sweden, not with blood or conquest, but with a refusal. In an age when queens were expected to wed, breed, and obey, she chose instead to defy every expectation. Her legacy was not one of armies or treaties, but of freedom. The freedom to be entirely, scandalously herself. Snow fell endlessly over St. Petersburg, cloaking the unfinished palaces of the city in silence. But within the halls of power, silence never lasted long. Empress Anna Ionovna of Russia reigned with a heavy hand. And where her will extended, cruelty followed. Born the niece of Peter the Great, Anna was raised not with the refinement of the capital, but in the cold province of Courland. She grew into a woman of broad frame and stern features, with piercing eyes that brooked no defiance. When the Russian throne fell to her, the nobility believed they could rule through her, binding her with contracts that limited her authority. They underestimated her. With a sweep of her hand, she tore the documents and declared herself autocrat. No one dared protest. Anna delighted in shows of power that mixed cruelty with spectacle. She adored hunting, not only for sport, but for the sight of terrified animals brought before her. At court, she amused herself with cruel jests. She commanded dwarfs to wrestle, mocked her courtiers' weaknesses, and invented elaborate humiliations for those who displeased her. Her laughter, deep and booming, filled the chambers as nobles cowered, but nothing revealed Anna's strange mind more than the ice palace. In the brutal winter of 1740, she ordered an entire palace built from blocks of ice along the Neva River. Towers, walls, even furniture were carved of frozen water. It glittered like crystal in the pale northern sun, a fantasy conjured from frost. Into this icy monument, Anna staged her most infamous cruelty. She forced a courtier who had displeased her to marry a servant woman. Dressed in ridiculous costumes, the pair were paraded before the court, mocked and jeered, before being locked for their wedding night inside the freezing palace. Guards surrounded the glittering prison to ensure no escape. The couple nearly froze to death. Anna's laughter echoed long after the screams faded. Foreign envoys wrote in horror of these spectacles, yet none could deny Anna's absolute power. She ruled for 10 years, her hand heavy upon taxes, her court riddled with spies and fear. Those who opposed her vanished, sent to Siberia or worse. Yet she surrounded herself with luxury, fountains of imported wine, walls hung with velvet, feasts that lasted until dawn. Anna herself seemed untouched by doubt. She walked her icy halls with the stride of a soldier, draped in heavy furs, her eyes glinting with satisfaction at the obedience she commanded. She cared little for refinement, less for diplomacy, but all for domination. When she died in 1740, her empire exhaled in relief. But the memory of the Ice Empress lingered, a ruler whose reign was etched not in glory, but in fear and frost. Her frozen palace stood as a symbol of her madness, glittering, cruel. and cold as the heart that conceived it. The Forbidden City shimmered beneath the blazing sun, its vermilion walls and golden roofs rising like a vision from another world. Within those walls, behind silk curtains and lacquered doors, sat the woman who held the fate of the Qing Empire in her hands, Empress Dowager Cixi. She had begun her life as a low-ranking concubine, chosen for her beauty and cunning. Yet when the emperor died suddenly, leaving only a child as heir, Cixi seized her moment. From behind a screen, she ruled as regent, her voice soft yet sharper than any blade. Ministers trembled at her glance. Generals bowed their heads. The empire was hers, though no crown rested upon it. Cixi possessed habits that bewildered even her closest attendants. She insisted on extravagant rituals. Each morning she bathed in milk, her servants pouring it into jade basins warmed with fire. She demanded dishes of exotic delicacies, bird's nest soup, lychee from the south, tea brewed with water from hidden springs. Her chambers overflowed with treasures, robes embroidered with dragons, pearls large as plums, jade carvings gleaming in lamplight. But beneath the surface of luxury lay iron cruelty. When a servant displeased her, Cixi could order punishment without hesitation. Whispers spoke of beatings, executions, even disappearances. Yet she always smiled serenely, as though cruelty were simply another act of governance. Her most infamous indulgence was her obsession with theater. Night after night, actors performed elaborate operas while she sat upon her throne of carved sandalwood, her face painted with delight. Entire palaces were rebuilt to house her stages. She chose favorite actors, showered them with gifts, and demanded that scenes be rewritten to flatter her. Some whispered that the empire itself had become her stage, with ministers and generals playing roles she dictated. Foreign envoys who entered her presence returned awed and unsettled. They described her as ageless, her face a mask of calm beauty, her eyes glittering with calculation. She spoke with courtesy, but every word was a command. She concealed her ambitions behind embroidered curtains, ruling while emperors came and went like shadows. In 1861, when rivals sought to strip her of power, she struck first. In a daring coup, she summoned loyal guards, seized the imperial seal, and executed her enemies. From that moment on, none dared to question her. She reigned for nearly half a century, steering China through rebellions, wars, and foreign invasions, all from behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. To her allies, Cixi was the guardian of tradition, the mother of the empire. To her enemies, she was a dragon cloaked in silk, ruthless and insatiable. She left behind an empire weakened and divided. Yet her legend endured, the concubine who rose to absolute power, the empress who ruled from behind a screen, the woman whose habits of luxury and cruelty became as famous as her reign. Thus the tale of Cixi closes the gallery of queens with insane habits. Some ruled with fear, some with madness, some with eccentricity. But Cixi mastered them all, turning her court into a theater where she was forever the star. The island of Madagascar lay like a jewel in the Indian Ocean, lush forests and jagged mountains rising from the sea. In 1828, its throne passed into the hands of Ranavalona I, a queen whose rule would plunge the island into an age of fear and isolation. She was not born to rule. As the widow of King Radama I, she secured her place by cunning and ruthless calculation. On the king's death, she orchestrated a palace coup, ordering rivals killed in the night. When dawn broke, the throne was hers, and none dared oppose her. From the beginning, Ranavalona sought to cast out foreign influence. European missionaries who had arrived in Radama's time were suddenly suspect. She despised their teachings, calling them a threat to her authority. Churches were burned, converts hunted. Some were tortured, others hurled from cliffs into the sea. Ranavalona watched these purges with cold satisfaction, declaring, "The customs of our ancestors are enough for us." Her court became infamous for its rituals of terror. She revived the Tangina ordeal, an ancient poison trial. Accused men and women were forced to swallow poison extracted from the Tangina nut. If they vomited it, they were declared innocent, but most convulsed and died. Thousands perished under this ritual of justice, their fates sealed by superstition and the Queen's decree. Ranavalona's cruelty was matched only by her paranoia. She built a network of spies that reached into every village. Whispers against her carried a death sentence. Her servants trembled at her commands. Her generals bowed under her glare. Yet she lived surrounded by luxury silken robes, golden jewelry, and feasts that contrasted with the famine her policies brought. Despite this, she was fiercely protective of Madagascar's independence. She drove out European armies, resisted French and British encroachment, and kept her island untouched by colonization during her lifetime. Some admired her as a guardian of sovereignty. Others cursed her as a tyrant who ruled with blood. When she died in 1861, the island sighed with relief. But the memory of Ranavalona endured, a queen who turned paradise into a prison, who ruled with poison and fear, and whose habits of cruelty carved her name into history as one of the most insane monarchs to ever reign.